Polypede Works here, coming to you once again with One Piece chapter 1137, entitled Shamrock Takes the Stage. So, in our cover story, which is the 23rd installment of the cover story, good lord, how long is this going to be? But yeah, Tama and Yamato bust in on Who's little hideaway, and we see some of his goons, which are very reminiscent of the goons he had with him when he was a beast pirate. Though they just seem to be wearing cat ears, very reminiscent of the brothers that were around Kuro back in the day. It kind of reminds me of that, especially seeing as how Kuro had a technique very reminiscent of Soru or Shave, and Who's Who is a six powers master that rivals the prodigy of Rob Lucci, who is also a Catman. So yeah, the Catman Chronicles of having super speed continue, and yeah, it just seems like Who's Who is operating all on his lonesome, at least for now, which really does give precedent to how oddly important he was. More important than Jack. But Jack can still show up. It's weird that he was more important than Jack, and Jack held a higher station than him in the Beast Pirates. So we'll just wait and see what's going on in the future in Volume 24. If we get Volume 24, 1138, because no break next week. Just going to say that off the bat. So I do find it interesting that we are covering Yamato and now Who's Who, two people who canonically have biological horns in this chapter specifically, because we find out that even though, according to Road, there are no more purebred ancient giants, and they're still calling them ancient giants, but seeing as how there are no purebred ancient giants, some giants do have ancient giant blood in them, and that's why a lot of them have horns. Apparently, King Harold also had horns, as we see a portrait of him in this chapter, but he ripped his out because he was showing a sign of resolve in how he wanted the country of Elbaf to go, which is very interesting, as apparently horns are a marking of Elbaf's past as a war nation. Of course, the place where war was born, as Loki says at the start of this arc. But that lets you kind of start to think a little bit more about Loki himself, because now I'm wondering, is his helmet just a steel straw hat, and are those horns his real horns? Because that's something to think about. I wonder. And I'm wondering too, is the whole horn bit with now giants a kind of, I guess, analogy or analog to the Saiyan tails that appear in Dragon Ball? I wonder if there's any other significance to giants having natural horns. Because from the looks of it, what Rose says about King Harold, it seems as though those who have ancient giant blood within them are just naturally bigger than giants who don't have horns. Which would make sense because ancient giants are humongous, as we know. So it's also interesting, too, that we get introduced to a full-blooded ancient giant corpse in Ors all the way back in Thriller Bark, and he's been a talking point forever, because we also have the numbers that appear in Wano. Though I'm not too certain on the nature of the numbers, I think from what it is said, and based on, I think his name is Hachi, or Hachan, not the octopus guy on the All On Pirates, the one that looks oddly like Austin Powers wearing a yellow jacket, who was number 8, and the number is that guy. He's like 188 years old, if I recall. So I think they were just revived by Vegapunk, but for whatever reason, I guess seeing as how most of them are kind of wild and violent, which then means they weren't able to be utilized by the world government, so they were just kind of trashed, and Kaido picked them up. At least that's what I think the story is, seeing as how Vegapunk did have some involvement in them coming back. I guess in a similar fashion to the dragons. But yeah, from this, we glean too that Loki's horns could be natural, as Loki is the son, the biological son of King Harold, as is Haruden. However, Haruden's mother was not a giant of Elbaf. That is why we see Haruden with Big Mom and Gerd along with Fallbeard and Mountbeard in the village during Big Mom's flashback, because he was not allowed in Arkst Castle. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but yeah, which is the castle that Nami, Luffy, Zoro, and Road are visiting right now, in which we see all the corpses along with the portrait of King Harold. So with that being said, that is very interesting that they are estranged brothers. It also makes sense too now, and I made a video about this called Loki's Belt, that Loki does indeed identify himself as a prince because he was the honored one, because his mother came from Elbaf. So he did identify more as a prince because he was the rightful heir to the throne, because his brother had dirty blood within him because of his mother, because she was from a nation that wasn't associated with Elbaf, which then fuels Haruden's dream to unite all the giant nations together, which I think is really cool. And this is how, too, Road and Haruden started to form a relationship, because they were both outcasts. Haruden because of his dirty blood, and Road because he was a nerd. And that's how they formed together, and that's why Road is now in the new Giant Warrior Pirates, because even at an early age, Haruden saw that he was very good at making maps. So that in itself is very touching, and I'm glad we are getting so much development for this section of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. I think that's really cool within itself. I really do. I think that's immaculate. So yeah, I'm so happy that we're finally getting some giant genealogy here, which then doubles back into thinking about, okay, what does this mean for Onis? Because Onis are all kind of big. Because I looked it up. Who's who is 11 feet tall? Kaido is humongous, as you know. And then Yamato's not a slouch because she's like 8'3" or something like that. Of course, Black Maria was humongous as well. She was bigger than Kaido. So it's just kind of weird that we have this now, because all of them too are depicted in being fairly strong people. I think the smallest ones so far are actually Page 1 and Ulti. Page 1 and Ulti are the smallest members of the Onis, if they are Onis, which I believe they are. But as you know too, Sasaki is not an Oni. He is a fishman, so he doesn't count. And of course, Jack 2 is a fishman. He doesn't count. So yeah, out of the Onis, most of them are humongous, and all of them are very, very strong. So I really do wonder, how did Onis come about? Because from this depiction that we see of normal giants having ancient giant blood and therefore having natural horns, it begs the question, then Onis must be of a similar line, because as far as ancient giants have been introduced in the story, there is always a Oni lurking about close behind. Like when Ors was, I guess you could say, resurrected in Thriller Bark, we have Moria. Gecko Moria is a big fellow who has horns growing out of his head. And then that pairs well with Kaido, because of course, both he and Kaido have a relationship. We know that. But then too, Kaido, who we know is an Oni, kept ancient giants around as well as other fellow Onis. So the parallels are, as I've been saying for a long time, they can't be ignored. They're very, very, very clear. And of course, we know Buccaneers have giants' blood in them as well. So we know too, for sure, that Buccaneers are related to giants. So we have to find out more about this. It's very interesting though, and I'm glad in this chapter we're actually getting some answers. It's trickling out very slowly, but I'm happy we are getting movement. With that being said, I'm still under the impression that King Harold might be a bad guy, because even when we're talking about, or at least framed in a particular way to be a bad guy, even though his actions seem justified, I don't think we have the full story. And I think there was a reason why Loki had to get rid of his father, if he was the one to do it at all. It's very funny too that he has a proud mustache, like Gold Roger a little bit. That's kind of cool, especially seeing as how he probably knew Roger, given that giants are pretty old or long lived. But with that being said, it's interesting how this is framed, because the story is that he ripped his horns out and that was his resolve to pave a path of peace for Elbath. But then that's matched with the dichotomy of not allowing your son to stay in the castle, even though his mother is not of Elbath. That's weird. That lets you know that there is a bit of a gray area here, that King Harold can't be wholly benevolent because you abandon one of your children. You kind of see what I'm saying? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in that way. But continuing, it's weird that he's talked about so highly, yet that's a besmirchment on his character. So I stick by my guns in saying that Loki, especially in the way that he's been characterized up into this point and even into this chapter, he seems to be the good guy. He really does seem to be the good guy, despite his intentions being very similar to Doflamingo in that he wants to destroy the world. But as things are going, it seems as though King Harold might not be the good guy that we think he is. And Haruden and Loki are our good boys, because Loki at least has a strong warrior's code and Haruden wants to unite all the giant tribes of the world. Which begs the question too, where else are there giants? Because now that reminds me too of the one giant whose name escapes me because he was just named in this most recent SBS. He's a huge giant, but he too wears a bowler hat and he has horns, and he appeared during the Odin flashback. So this gives him a bit more context because he most likely had ancient giant blood within him as well. So I'm glad that that's cleared up now. That's cool, because I thought he was a pure ancient giant, but no, he most likely is just a giant with ancient giant blood within him. So I'm glad that has been cleared up now through what we learned here. Now, cutting back to Loki and his Holy Night visitors, Gunko is giving him the work. And Gunko's design, I just found out, could be a reference to a military uniform called a gunpuku, because her style of dress and the uniform look very similar to one another. And her name sounds like Gunpuku, even though it's Gunko, so that's probably where it comes from. And here we find that she has something called the arrow fruit. So I was correct in saying that it was a doe fruit, and it's very similar to Doflamingo and how she controls it. Additionally, which is very reminiscent of, say, like Mr. 3 and other characters who are paramecias who generate things, she makes some additions to her body using her doe fruit. The first thing we see are these huge boots, these huge replicas of her, I guess, Holy Night boots that she makes out of arrows as she's beating down on Loki very viciously because he does not want to join the Holy Knights. A weird thing too, and I don't know if this is part of the ability, but it looks just like what Emu does to Sabo and Cobra back in the day when Sabo was invading Mary Joie. But she stomps on the ground, some black flame comes out, and an arrow spawns from that black flame and attacks Loki. So I don't know. So maybe that was an awakening in turning the ground into arrows, but just on a very, very small scale, perhaps, seeing as how we don't know what these arrows are necessarily made out of. She could also use these weird arrow constructs to make gauntlets for herself as well. So not only is she giving herself like these stilt boots, but she can also give herself big gauntlets. It's so interesting how this is done, because a thought came to mind, especially seeing as how arrows are usually used to indicate speed. I wonder, is the arrow fruit the other half of the more fruit? because Babella, I think his name was, the owl that we meet in the library, he could increase the size of objects. But if you don't know, the more fruit could do the same thing, but the more fruit could also increase the speed of objects. So maybe there's a type of speed or velocity element to these arrows, because it just feels like the attack is supposed to be fast. And they do have a very magical quality about them. I originally thought they were ribbons or sashes or something like that, but no, they just seem to be like these weird constructs that are very fabric-like, but don't seem to be particularly made out of anything. Overall, very interesting indeed, as they are able to hurt Loki. And they've been useful in eliminating all of Loki's little buddies, these strong-willed animals that we met very early on, which is sad because they're just bleeding out. Like, man, these arrows are no joke. So it really does paint a picture for how strong the Holy Knights are. So I'm happy that we're seeing this here. Very cool, very interesting. And she's just going to work on Loki, beating him down as he keeps refusing to join the Holy Knights. He's so cool, though. He's so cool for it, because that's what makes you believe that he's not a bad guy, because his resolve is so strong, right? But Gunko is stopped by her partner, and her partner is revealed to be someone who looks a lot like Shanks, the new leader of the Holy Knights, Shamrock Figureland, or Figureland Shamrock, the son of Saint Garling, newly appointed Saint Garling, might I add. And of course, we have Gunko of the Holy Knights, who is the user of the arrow fruit, making her an arrow human. And her gauntlets look sick. Goodness gracious. But looking at Shamrock, right? Okay, we gotta talk about some things. Do I believe the Shanks allegations are over? I do not, and I think that deserves its own video. But I will say this. The funny thing, even though he has an arm, mind you, his arm is covered and his hand is gloved. And his outfit is killer, by the way. He looks very regal. So Holy Knight is an apt depiction. He's even got the same greaves in a way that Gunko has. So yeah, no, he looks regal. He fits the description of a Holy Knight. I get it entirely. But what's interesting too is that he has a sword, much like Shanks and much like Figureland Garland. It's got that weird swoop. It kind of looks like a scimitar a little bit. So yeah, they all have the same kind of sword. How odd. But what I was about to say is that the funny thing about the Wano saga is that we have two different situations in which somebody can just naturally change who they are or how they look. And I'll leave it at that for another video. So do I think the Shanks allegations are over? Not at all. I don't think this is a new character. But overall, very interesting chapter. I'm glad there's no break next week. Loki continues to be a solid character. And yeah, King Harold and Shanks are still on Fraud and Rat Watch. We'll have to see. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede. What's it?